Yo, what's up guys? It's Talon. So today I have a meta report video for you guys. Basically, I'm going to give you guys the best champions for every role and explain how to climb, in terms of champion picks for the current season. We're approaching about the middle point of the season, nearing the end of the season. So I'm sure you guys want to make sure that you understand the meta and the best champions to climb. And so I'm just going to go through every role and explain that to you guys. It's essentially my version of a tier list where I'm going to just give you guys, again, the best champions for each role and then how to counter them, the best, types of champs, all these types of things. So getting right into top lane, currently a lot of the best top lane champions are pretty similar to the past, where a lot of bruiser top laners are really strong. So Renekton, in my opinion, probably the best top laner overall. Aatrox, Mordekaiser, Darius, and Riven. These are all of the really strong bruiser top laners right now. And then like a sort of a little bit below those would be champions like Sett and Garen as some other bruisers that are still solid, but not quite as strong. Then we have a couple really strong AP top laners as well. Again, Mordekaiser, as we already mentioned, but then Gragas as well sort of is another bruiser and a really strong AP top laner who's definitely just a solid champion overall. All of these champions that I just mentioned are very good to pick in nearly any scenario. They're going to be very consistent, and that's why they're really at the top of the meta, because they don't have that many bad matchups. Camille is going to be also a champion that you can pick in most scenarios, but she's more of a split pusher and more based around that than the other champions on this list. And she's also a better tank killer than a lot of the champions on this list so far. So if you need a tank killer or a split pusher, Camille is going to be the top champion to pick in that situation. Darius is also really good into tanks as well. And then some other champions, Yone and Yasuo, are always going to be relatively strong because of their kits, but they struggle a bit more in certain matchups, especially into some of these certain bruisers who can really bully them in lane, and so that's why they're not quite as strong. Fiora is sort of a substitute for Camille, where she's also a split pusher who's good into tanks, but she's just not quite as strong in team fighting, so she's a bit more one-dimensional in comparison to Camille overall. Tanks, as always, are not bad. They're solid picks to sort of facilitate your teammates, but you're not really going to be able to carry on tanks like Ornn or Maokai or Malphite or whoever. But these champions are still going to be solid. You can pick them, especially if you don't feel like you're going to get punished by certain champions or you want to find opportunities to rotate. So for example, if you're into a top laner like Garen, where you don't really feel like you're going to stomp him in lane, but you also want to be more useful than him in team fights, you can pick a tank like Ornn and you're going to do pretty solid in that regard, especially if you're autofill and you don't really want to, learn a really hard champion. And then the last split pushing champion that's going to be really solid is going to be Jax. Similar to Fiora and Camille, he's a very solid split pusher. He's very consistent and overall a strong champion as well. And then a couple other champions you guys might be wondering about. Ambessa, one of the newest champions in Wild Rift, or the newest champion in Wild Rift, I think. Not a bad champion overall in top lane. Her scaling is really strong and her kit as a whole is really broken. However, in terms of laning, she's not too strong, and so I wouldn't really say that she's the best top lane champ right now. She's just not the greatest laner, but she's still pretty solid. And then another new addition to the meta is Warwick, where Warwick is a really solid top laner as well. Very absurd burst damage that he has, insane sustain in lane. So Mordekaiser definitely going to be one of the picks of this patch as well. If you're looking for a top laner to play, he's not hard to play. He's a very good laner and he scales still well. It has absurd damage. A little bit squishier, so it's possible to get one shot or ganked if you do get CC'd, but he's still absurdly strong. So overall, again, to reiterate the main points of the meta, bruisers still dominate the meta with champions like Renekton and Aatrox, Mordekaiser, Darius, and Riven. Then there's some split pushers like Camille especially, but also Jax and Fiora to a lesser extent that are still solid. Garen and Sett, some bruisers that work fine. Tanks can work if you have a fine matchup for them as always, and Yone, Yasuo have their certain matchups that they're good in. Of course, there's other champions as well. If you're ever curious about how your champion fits in the meta, just feel free to ask me about that. But those are really like the main staples of the top lane meta currently. Okay guys, so next up we have jungle. So the jungle meta has two broken junglers right now who are just far and away the best junglers in my opinion, and that's going to be Warwick and Ambessa. So Warwick has a strong early game. The new rework made him extremely broken. AP Warwick does absurd damage. He doesn't even need to land his ultimate anymore. He can just ult near you and then auto you, and he's just gonna suppress you and one-shot you. Absurd damage, extremely broken champion. And Ambessa is really, really good when she gets some items. She has great scaling and is a very strong champion and has just a pretty absurd kit. It's extremely easy to land her ultimate, which is of course very nice for her. So she is also just extremely broken because of, once she gets fed, once she gets a lead, pretty impossible to play into that champion. So those are 100% the top two junglers right now. Then we have some other really broken champions as well that are a little bit below that. Champions like Vi because of her absurd clear speed and her still strong scaling and playmaking ability. Riven because of his just resets and the fact that he's just got absurd damage as well. Lee Sin, if you're a solid Lee Sin, is still really strong in the meta. Many people disagree with that, but in my opinion, if you're a solid Lee Sin, you're still going to be able to really carry games. Wukong is a similar bruiser jungle where he just has a really strong early game. His scaling is not the best, but he has really good damage, and he's still going to be useful in terms of engaging later on in the game, so he's always going to be really strong. And then Xin Zhao is especially a good counter pick into ranged champions because of the ultimate, and his early game is just overall really strong as well. So all of those champions that I just mentioned, Vi, Riven, Lee Sin, Wukong, and Xin Zhao are extremely strong bruiser junglers. So if you're looking for a bruiser jungler, those are the best ones for sure. They're all going to be really strong. Shyvana is going to be kind of a mix of a bruiser and a tank. She got a recent buff, and she's definitely very solid. The only issue is that her early game still struggles to make a lot of an impact. But once you're able to get on an item or two, when you get that ultimate, everything like that, she is a very strong champion. She gets her ultimate a lot quicker now. So definitely a strong champion as well with her new buff. But in my opinion, not quite on the same level as some of those other previously mentioned champions. Then if you're looking for an AP jungler, Echo is going to be the best one right now. Echo is absurdly broken. Extremely strong AP jungler. Lilia is going to be a great AP jungler in the tanks. Gragas is always a solid one. And Diana is going to be the best assassin AP jungler apart from Echo. Maokai and Amumu, they're going to be solid tank jungles as always. They're just, they have pretty much everything you would need from a tank jungler in terms of engaging. That's what, you really want from a tank jungler, is really good engaging and ganking potential, and they provide exactly that. Talon and Rengar, by far the best jungle assassins, especially AD assassins. Of course, like I said, you have Echo and Diana as AP assassins, but for an AD assassin, and in general, Talon and Rengar, super broken in jungle. So those are a lot of the main things. Again, depending on what you need, whether you need just an OP pick that's good in every scenario, such as Warwick, or Ambessa, obviously just as the two best. Then you got those bruiser junglers that we mentioned. You got Shyvana, who's sort of a mix of a bruiser and a tank. The pure tanks like Maokai and Amumu, and then the assassins like Talon and Rengar. That's really going to be the main jungle meta. Again, of course, there's some more champions that can fit in niche scenarios when you see a good opportunity, but overall, those are the best junglers right now. Okay guys, so now we have the mid lane meta, and so in my opinion, Syndra is currently just going to be the best mid laner overall. Extremely consistent champion, very good laning, scales really well, pretty much just good at all times. And then because of Syndra and some of the other champs that we'll talk about, Kassadin becomes one of the strongest champs as well. Very solid into AP champions in general. Just a very good champ into most champs right now, and very good damage, scaling, everything like that, which is why that's definitely going to be one of the overall best mids as well. And then Echo going to be the last one in that sort of highest tier of champions. Echo just has pretty absurd burst damage now with his buff and everything. Very strong champ overall, definitely. Just extremely consistent, broken champion, honestly, right now in both mid and jungle. And then you have other really good mages, especially like Heimerdinger has a really solid lane phase and scales really well, so he's definitely a little bit below those other champions mentioned, but still extremely strong as a whole. Morgana is going to be probably the most consistent and easy to play mid laner. If you're really just looking for, say, an autofill champion to play, you're going to pretty easily, do well with Morgana. Ziggs is going to be sort of a worse version of Morgana, where they do pretty similar things, but he's still very solid as well. And then Zoe, overall, in my opinion, one of the most underrated champions in the game. Very consistent burst damage. Strong lane phase despite scaling really well. Really good sort of assassin-y type of mage champion if you're looking for a burst champ like that. And then Vlad's scaling is just really good. So if you're able to get two or three items, Vlad's going to be able to pretty much carry a game. Some of the best assassins right now, after those initial ones that we mentioned, would be like Akali, Fizz, and Zed. They all have good burst damage, decent enough lane phase that you can get through it, and then, make it to the later parts of the game where you can one-shot squishies. So if you see a squishy comp, you're going to want to pick one of those. And then if those AP assassins are picked, you can counter them with a champion like Galio, like Kassadin into those AP assassins, like we said, or a champion like Lissandra. All of those are going to be good counters to those assassins when you do see them. And then lane bullies like Jace, Akshan, or Lucian, especially Jace right now, are going to be really good counters whenever you see a scaling champion who you really want to bully early game. Especially if you have an AP jungler, then you're definitely going to want to pick one of those types of champions. Yone and Yasuo are also some good AD champions if you have an AP jungler. And then some of those playmaking roaming mids, if you like that type of style, like Ahri, Lissandra again, or Annie, are all still pretty solid champions. So if you like that style of roaming with your jungler, making a lot of plays, setting up your team, those are going to be the best champions. So overall, again, Syndra definitely at the top, with Kassadin and Echo being quite close. And then some of those other mages falling a little bit behind. And then you have these different niche scenarios like assassins, if you want to pick them, countering those assassins with certain champions, lane bullies, playmaking mids, all of these types of things overall in the mid lane meta. Okay, and then for ADC, you have Varus as just the best champion right now in ADC. Very consistent, good laner, still pretty good scaling, works well with most types of supports, but he doesn't quite love playing with the best like hyper carry supports. What I mean by that is the supports who really facilitate hyper carries like Milio, Lulu, and Yuumi. So if you're having a type of champion like Lulu, Milio, Yuumi, then the better champion of the top 2 champions in ADC right now is going to be Kai'Sa. So basically, Varus works a lot better with those more aggressive supports, and overall is a very consistent champion who works with everyone. And then Kai'Sa is a bit more support reliant, but still absurdly broken, especially when you get those types of champs. But overall, those are the top 2 ADCs right now. And then Xayah and Ezreal are both just champions you can pick pretty much whenever. They're going to be super consistent with basically any type of support, whether it's an enchanter, a tank, anything like that. Ezreal doesn't really want to play with a Lulu or Emilio, but pretty much any other support is going to go well. But overall, those 2 champions both just work consistently well. Caitlyn right now is specifically OP with a champion like Emilio or Lulu, but it still works well with some other champs, like for example Lux or Morgana. So Caitlyn, very, very strong lane bully, especially with those certain champions. And then Lucian right now with his new buff, one of the best ADCs as well, especially Lucian Nami, Lucian with pretty much any enchanter who's going to shield or heal him and really take, make use of his passive. But he still works well with tanks because an aggressive tank support can still get him a lot of value for sure, and make good engages, allow him to do all that stuff. So overall, those are going to be some of the best champions right now. Lucian and Caitlyn for lane bullying, Varus and Kai'Sa consistently really strong, and then Xayah and Ezreal when you need a safe champion who you know you can play really well on. Zeri, Sivir, and Tristana are all going to be some good hyper carry champions. They're going to be a bit more reliant on support again, so you're going to usually want to pick those champions, most commonly with one of these enchanters, which are overall the main meta of support. Miss Fortune is a really strong, solid champion, honestly, and really good into bad players. The problem with Miss Fortune is she doesn't really like playing with these enchanters that are, again, really meta, as we'll talk about in the support meta. And so when you see your teammate pick a Leona, Leona, Thresh, Nautilus, right? Any engaged support, Miss Fortune's gonna be extremely powerful because they can easily set up for the Miss Fortune ultimate and everything. But when you have a Yuumi or a Lulu or a Emilio, there's a lot of better champions to play than Miss Fortune, and you're not really going to want to do it. Miss Fortune can work with those, but there's just better options, which is why Miss Fortune, despite being a strong champion, just doesn't fit the best with the support meta right now. Kalista is going to be a great lane bully, but it's going to kind of struggle to close out games, which is why, to me, Kalista is still solid, but not quite near the top. And then, in my opinion, one of the last champs I think people might, wonder about is Jhin. And honestly, I don't think Jin's that good right now. I think a lot of people do disagree with that. But in my opinion, this champion, I mean, his lane phase is fine. His scaling is okay, but it's still worse than most other of the top ADCs right now. And just overall not like the best carry champion. But definitely there's people who find value from him and think he's a solid champion overall. But again, to reiterate, Varus and Kai'Sa are the main champions. And then, again, we spoke about all of the specifics with the rest of the ADC meta right now. Okay, and lastly, we have the support meta, guys. And I'm going to make distinctions between solo queue and not solo queue for this, because support is the main role that kind of differs depending on whether you're solo or duo. So the overall meta, the strongest champions, say you're duo or whatever, Lulu and Emilio, they're going to be extremely good with hyper carry champions. That's the main thing that they're good with. They're not really good with some ADCs, but any hyper carry ADC who's based around auto attacking, those two champions are going to do amazing with. And then Yuumi is sort of a worse version of Lulu or Emilio, still solid with hyper carries, but just not quite as good as those two. Soraka is going to be an enchanter that has a bit more carry potential and works with a more wide variety of champs, and is also extremely strong. So those are going to be the best enchanters overall, especially Lulu, Emilio, and Soraka. And then again, Yuumi can still fulfill a similar job if you want. In terms of tanks, which are going to be better solo queue champions, Thresh and Nautilus are the best tanks right now. They have solid lane phases and still scale really well. Nautilus is going to be good in more scenarios. Thresh is obviously going to be better into higher AD champions, but can still be good in either scenario overall. And so those are going to be the best tanks. And then other tanks, will also work very well. And then Braum is going to be one of the most underrated supports right now in the meta, especially when you have a Lucian or you have an Ezreal or an Ashe. All of these champions who can proc his passive work insanely well with him, so he's definitely an underrated support as well in the meta, but he's also a bit more team reliant. So if you're looking for these solo queue champions, Thresh and Nautilus going to be better for carrying, but Lulu, Melio going to work really well with the hyper carries, and Soraka going to be a good middle ground between an enchanter who can help facilitate hyper carries, but can also have a bit more sort of playmaking potential with her absurd healing to potentially turn more games around. Most other tanks and enchanters do a similar thing, just worse than the ones I previously mentioned, so I won't go over all of them, but they're all still, they can fulfill the same job, just not quite as efficiently, basically. And then, of course, I know you guys will always ask about Swain and Jarvan, you know, the broken support specials, and both of these champions, they're better in solo queue than duo queue because of the fact that they're not actually overall as strong, but they're good for having more, like, you know, carry potential and everything. So for Swain, you're not going to want to pick him every game. He's not going to be super strong in every game. But when you see the enemy pick a lot of melee champions, say they lock in a melee support, or they lock in maybe some assassin mid and some other tanky or melee champions, Swain's going to be really well because he can really get a lot of value from his ultimate and everything like that. But if the enemy are really high range or they have a lot of enchanters and sort of like ways to kite you and everything, I wouldn't recommend picking Swain in those scenarios. And then Jarvan is going to be really good as an engaged champion into champions who don't have a lot of dashes or ways to get out of his ultimate. So for example, a champion like, or a bot lane like Jinx and Lulu, they're not going to be able to escape your ultimate, or Sivir or whatever, right? If you see a lot of champs who just can't escape, then I recommend picking Jarvan. But again, I don't recommend it in a vast majority of scenarios. But these champions, again, they both get better in solo queue. They both fit in those scenarios specifically that I discussed. And overall, they're still solid champions, even if, in my opinion, they're not, you know, as consistent as some of these tanks like Thresh or Nautilus, for example. All right, guys, so that's going to do it for the video. I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, you know, please like or subscribe or whatever, all those cool things. If you guys don't know, I now have memberships on my YouTube channel, so it's $5 a month, and you can get access to over 38 pages of coaching notes that I have. You can also get early access to videos, usually about 12 plus hours in advance before it releases to everyone else. You get some cool emotes and some other things like that, but those are some of the main perks of it. And I also shout you out in YouTube videos. So I'm just going to shout out right now the people who have became some of the first members of my channel. So shout out to the first member, Senna, and then Dav D Goat, David Damasio, JB, Bloop, Kobe Cesar, Pablo, Bicop, and I don't know how to say the last one because it's in a language I don't speak, but thank you as well. You know who you are. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.